Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 19 of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of classic and also some, but not very many, vintage cars. And in this particular pick we're featuring a vehicle which is the kind of car that usually I would drive quite a lot, because it's different, it's underappreciated, it's quirky, but at the same time it's a car which I don't necessarily drive as much as it deserves to be used. And the car is the Triumph Spitfire. It's currently the only Triumph ever to be featured on Gran Turismo. I really hope that they feature some of their other cars, especially my personal favourite Triumph, the Dolomite Sprint, because Triumph has made some pretty interesting cars. They're not necessarily the kind of cars that will dominate their category, certainly not dominate the racing game as a whole, but they're different, they're quirky, they offer a package which can be used effectively, especially at lower PP levels. And there are certain companies which generally fit within that kind of area. You may think of Lotus, Marcos, Ginetta, that kind of thing. They're all similar in that regard, and they're good at it, so why stray too far from that? That's the case with Triumph. They're very good at making small, lightweight, nimble, sporty vehicles, but at the same time that aren't necessarily full-on sports cars. The Spitfire, for instance, back in the day, and also on the game, was a car which is essentially the classic equivalent of something like a Mazda MX-5. It was designed to bring a sporty image and the fun of driving to a wider audience, an audience which may not have necessarily been able to afford something like a TVR, a Jag E-Type, etc. If you can't afford those cars, your options were very limited, so Triumph filled that niche with a truly affordable, lower level sports car that you could take the roof off of and have fun, and that also looked the part. Personally, I think that the Spitfire has a very similar overall look to a TVR, and many people have noted over the years that it seems to pretty much be what Britain does best, making small lightweight sports cars. Lotus, the Vauxhall VX220, Light Car Company, Marcos, TVR, Ginetta, and a massive variety of others, which aren't even featured on the game for the most part, such as Morgan, Westfield, Grinnell even. There are a broad variety. Most of them, though, aren't featured on the game, not at the moment at least. So the question is, if you are thinking of buying a car like this, or maybe you haven't bought one yet but fancy trying something a bit different, what can you expect? Because straight off the bat, this is not a huge amount of money to pay out for a classic. In fact, in that regard, it's one of the best classics in the game for a beginner, because it's so much more affordable. Alongside the Mini Marcos, this is an extremely cheap car, especially for a classic. A lot of the classics are very, very expensive. This car, though, only costs 17,000 credits, which is actually cheaper not only than most other classics and most other sports cars, but actually cheaper than most other sporty vehicles in general, even hot hatches. It's a remarkably cheap price on the game. Now, for that, you get rear-wheel drive, a front-engine layout with a 1.5 litre turbochargeable engine. Now, with said turbo, you're putting out 258 horsepower. Now, that's not a huge amount. It's not going to worry a Shelby Cobra et al. Anytime soon. But in a car that with the full weight loss package only weighs 705 kilos, that's a pretty good combination to have. And one of the great things about the Spitfire is what it's able to do with the spec that it's given. It doesn't have a huge amount of power. It's only got a tiny bit more power than, say, the Prince Skyline, which itself isn't a particularly quick car. I remarked before in the episode featuring that vehicle that it's better as a cruiser than a racer. The difference with the Triumph is that it actually delivers performance that you would want from a slightly lower powered classic. It really uses that to its advantage, to be small, nimble, lightweight, and potentially great on certain tracks in certain circumstances. Now, as far as torque, it actually puts out more than you'd probably think. 210 foot-pounds is not bad at all for such a tiny engine, especially a classic one. We already mentioned that it weighs 705 kilos, which is very good, and it puts out, thanks to primarily that low weight, 366 horsepower per tonne, which, given the low power, is not bad at all. The PP, though, is definitely too high. It's one of those cars which you can understand why it's so high, but at the same time, you kind of wish that it wasn't. It suffers from what I call the Red Bull Junior syndrome, which means that a car essentially has a PP where it's high because it's small and light, but it can't really compete at that level. Now, some vehicles do live up to that, such as the Suzuki GSX R4 and the light car company Rocket. Others, though, like most notably the Red Bull Junior, just cannot compete at that level under any circumstance. Now, that's not the case with this car. It can certainly compete, but the maximum PP of 512 is far too high. I would never recommend racing this car even at 500 PP, let alone 512. It's just not quick enough. However, at say 450, even down as far as say 400 or 425, and I would say as high as say 475 to be safe, you can use this car very effectively. It doesn't have a huge amount of power to work with, but you can keep the weight nice and low, and the performance that you get from said power is better than you'd expect. The top speed is not bad at all, the acceleration is very good thanks to the low weight, and because of the way the car was designed, even though it's not an extremely quick car as standard, the shape and style of the car mean that it naturally lends itself towards being fast. It's low, it's a two-door, it's a sports car shape. So you take something big and boxy and bulky and try to make it into a track car, you're going to have a bit of a bad time with that because it's just not designed for it. Whereas with a sports car, it's naturally already more ready for that. So definitely check out the Spitfire if you're looking for something different for low PP racing. And that's it for this episode, so I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.